It was a Thursday evening, just after 8 p.m., and the lights in the studio gleamed with that clinical, almost sterile brightness that only a television set could create. The audience, mostly regulars from the conservative side of the spectrum, were settling into their seats in Manhattan Beach, California. They had snacks, drinks, and most importantly, half-smirks plastered on their faces. Tonight, they were anticipating a clash-on that was expected to be predictable, maybe even a little fun. This wasn't just any typical panel discussion on criminal justice reform. It was a segment on The Gutfeld Show, where the host, Greg Gutfeld, was known for his sharp wit and sarcasm, often throwing out jokes laced with biting commentary. And tonight, his guest was none other than Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, former public defender who had worked tirelessly to shine a light on issues like systemic bias in the justice system and media accountability. The panel was already primed for a showdown. Crockett, dressed in her usual professional attire, adjusted her jacket as she took her seat on the set. There was no look of defiance or the usual combative posture you might expect from someone walking into the lion's den. Instead, she appeared calm, composed, almost laser-focused, like someone who had already anticipated the fireworks that were about to happen. And she wasn't wrong. The show started as most primetime segments do, with Gutfeld cracking jokes and flipping through his notes, setting the tone for the evening. He leaned forward, fixing his gaze on Crockett. "You've made some pretty bold claims about systemic bias in the justice system," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But let me ask you, have you ever actually read the Constitution? Or is that something your intern summarized for you?" The audience chuckled an easy, familiar laugh. It was meant to be lighthearted, a gentle jab, but Jasmine Crockett didn't crack a smile. Instead, she locked eyes with Gutfeld for a moment, almost as if taking a mental note of his words before responding, "Well, Greg, I was actually a public defender for nearly a decade. I've read more constitutional case law than you've had haircuts." She didn't flinch. No bravado. No attempt to outdo him with a bigger joke. She just calmly put her facts on the table. And right there, in that instant, the mood in the room shifted. There wasn't a dramatic shift, no dramatic gasp from the audience, no sudden uproar. But it was palpable. Everyone in the room could feel the slight change. Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to play games. She had done her homework, and it showed. The jokes, the mockery, the usual banter, none of it was going to rattle her. The show went on, with the other panelists an ex-judge, a political strategist, and a YouTube pundit chiming in from time to time. But the real energy in the room was centered around Crockett and Gutfeld. You could see it in the way the host was leaning into every opportunity to poke at her, to draw her into a back and forth. He had a rhythm to his attack, designed to get laughs and to maintain control. But Crockett, she wasn't interested in playing by those rules. She was listening, absorbing, and waiting for the right moment to respond. As the segment progressed, there was an undeniable undercurrent of tension between them. Gutfeld could feel it too, and he wasn't going to let it slide. The audience could tell this wasn't going to be just another scripted debate. Something was different. Something was about to break through. As the show progressed, the atmosphere in the studio became thicker with every word exchanged between Greg Gutfeld and Jasmine Crockett. Gutfeld, not used to being the one who was made to look foolish, leaned in even more, determined to keep control of the narrative. He quickly shifted tactics, sensing that his usual jabs weren't landing the way he expected. He began to poke at the very core of Crockett's stance on media accountability. "You've written an op-ed, right? Criticizing selective media outrage in criminal cases," Gutfeld said, holding up a printed copy of the article like it was a smoking gun. "So, let me get this straight," he continued, his voice rising. "You're saying that the media is complicit in injustice, yet you spend most of your energy criticizing this network?" His voice grew louder as he raised the article in the air, mocking the printed text. The audience, which had already been primed to root for Gutfeld's brand of comedy, let out a collective laugh. But Jasmine Crockett, she didn't flinch. There was no smirk, no attempt to play along with the mockery. She just sat there, arms folded, eyes locked on him. "You know, Greg," she said, her voice steady and calm, "you can mock me all you want, but the reality is, the media shapes how we perceive justice. When your network selectively airs one type of crime story and leaves out others, It's no wonder people are scared of the wrong things, and scared people vote based on fear. A quiet murmur rippled through the audience. A few people nodded, a few others exchanged glances, but no one dared to speak up. The tension was palpable now, like a string pulled taut, just waiting to snap. Gutfeld, sensing that he was losing his grip on the narrative, tried to regain control. He mocked her phrasing again, chuckled at her points, and even pulled out a plastic gavel to joke, "This is for when you go full lawyer on us." The audience laughed again, this time a little louder, as if trying to reclaim some of the momentum. But Jasmine didn't bite. She stayed focused, unaffected by his theatrics, and with each mockery, the tension in the room grew. She wasn't playing the same game as Gutfeld, she was playing a different one entirely, and in the way she didn't react to his antics, she was slowly but surely shifting the room's energy. Gutfeld, however, didn't want to let it go. He leaned forward once more, his tone sharp as he aimed to corner her. "You're saying that criminal justice reform is the answer, but look at the crime rates," he said, pulling up a set of crime statistics from Los Angeles. "This is what reform leads to: crime spikes, cities out of control. Are you really saying that's a better alternative?" Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't even lean in like he did. Instead, she replied slowly, methodically, almost as though she was explaining something to a child. "Law and order doesn't mean lawlessness for people who look like me," she said, her voice even unwavering. For the first time, the room went still. The laughter from the earlier jabs faded, replaced by a heavy silence. No one knew how to react to that. It wasn't an emotional outburst or a loud, fiery statement. It was just a simple truth, delivered in a way that left no room for rebuttal. Gutfeld, momentarily taken aback, tried to push back, but his words stumbled over themselves. He wasn't used to being confronted so directly, so calmly. The audience, now more aware than ever, was starting to shift in their seats. They had expected to watch a typical back and forth, a light-hearted clash. But what they were witnessing was something different. Jasmine wasn't here to fight back with volume or showmanship. She wasn't here to win the room with jokes. She was here to make a point, to make sure the conversation changed direction. And just as the room grew heavy with tension, she spoke again. "Reform matters," she said, almost to herself, as though she was speaking beyond the immediate debate. "But it won't happen if we keep pretending the system is fair, if we keep ignoring the people who slip through the cracks." Gutfeld, unable to maintain his usual confidence, looked away for a second, breaking eye contact. The game had changed, and he wasn't sure how to keep up anymore. As the tension built, the producers in the control room whispered into their headsets, realizing this segment had taken an unexpected turn. What was meant to be a simple 5-minute segment was now the focal point, and Jasmine Crockett was at its core. She wasn't just responding to Greg Gutfeld's jabs. She was using each attempt to undermine her as a chance to expose flaws in the arguments around her. Greg, now clearly feeling the weight of the conversation, turned the tables. "You say the media is complicit in injustice, but why do you spend all your energy criticizing this network?" He waved the printed article in the air, hoping to provoke her. "You've made a career out of pointing fingers, but isn't there a deeper issue here? You're just another politician playing the blame game." The audience's laughter this time wasn't as loud. It wasn't the same light-hearted response. People could sense the shift. This was no longer just a political clash. It had become personal, and everyone noticed it. Jasmine Crockett didn't take the bait. She didn't raise her voice or mock him. She simply looked at him, steady, and said, "Greg, it's not about playing the blame game. It's about pointing out the broken system we're all a part of. The media shapes public perception, and right now, it's framing criminal justice reform as a threat, when it's the solution." The silence that followed was heavy. The audience began to absorb her words. This wasn't typical political bickering. Jasmine had fought on the front lines, and she knew how to dismantle an argument with clarity and calm. Gutfeld, now visibly irritated, shifted tactics again. He raised a report showing Los Angeles crime statistics and waved it in front of the camera. "You want reform? Well, here's what happens when you push for it," he said, showing alarming crime rates. "More crime, more chaos. Is that what you're endorsing?" Jasmine Crockett, unbothered, leaned forward slightly, adjusting her microphone. Reform doesn't mean chaos, Greg. It means ending the punishment of people for their race or background. You can't keep ignoring the facts. Greg stared at her, his usual smirk faltering. He wasn't prepared for this. Jasmine wasn't just talking policy. She was talking about real lives affected by a broken system most only saw in headlines. And she wouldn't let Gutfeld turn it into a game. "You're turning this into a race issue," Greg accused, trying to redirect. "No, Greg," Jasmine calmly replied. "It's not me turning it into anything. This country was built on inequality, and I'm not pretending the paint job fixed it." The room fell silent. No one spoke. Even Gutfeld's loyal audience, who usually laughed at his every word, felt the weight of her statement. It wasn't loud or angry. It was a quiet, undeniable truth. Greg, now caught off guard, tried to press on, but his quick wit had failed him. Jasmine had shifted the ground beneath him, and he didn't know how to recover. The silence wasn't just from tension, it was because her message had landed, harder than anything else that night. The tension in the studio was unmistakable now. Greg Gutfeld had always been in control of the room, his quick wit and sharp jabs usually keeping the audience on his side. But tonight, something had changed. Every time he tried to poke fun at Jasmine Crockett, it only seemed to give her more room to expose the flaws in his arguments. Gutfeld leaned back in his chair, trying to recover. "You say the media's at fault, but don't you think that's just an easy scapegoat? The system is broken, sure, but what you're talking about doesn't seem like reform. It sounds like chaos. Do you really think this will make things better?" Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't respond with more fire or theatrics. She simply spoke her truth. What you call chaos is the system working as it was designed. Reform isn't about making things worse. It's about making things better for people who have been ignored for far too long. It's about ensuring that everyone, regardless of their background, gets a fair chance. The words hung in the air. The room felt smaller. There were no laughs, no quick comebacks from Gutfeld. The audience, which had expected a typical back and forth, suddenly found themselves caught in a moment of reflection. Gutfeld, clearly losing his rhythm, shifted his approach. "So, what exactly are you proposing? We just throw everything out and start over? Is that your solution?" Jasmine took a deep breath. "What I'm proposing is accountability, holding people responsible for the damage they've caused while pushing for a system that doesn't just serve the powerful." She paused, looking directly at the camera. "That means ensuring that people's futures aren't decided by where they were born or the color of their skin. That means recognizing the humanity in everyone." The quiet that followed was more than just an awkward pause. It was a moment of realization. Gutfeld had made a living by controlling the narrative, by dominating discussions with sharp comments and quick-witted insults. But here, in this studio, Jasmine had flipped the script. She didn't need to yell or become emotional. She simply spoke the truth with calm authority, and that was all it took to shift the balance. For the first time in the entire segment, Gutfeld wasn't in control. His usual smug expression was gone, replaced by a look of uncertainty. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly trying to figure out how to regain the upper hand. But Jasmine wasn't done yet. "The thing is, Greg," she continued, her voice calm but firm, "the system doesn't just need fixing. It needs to be completely rethought. And that starts with people in power, like you, recognizing that there is a bigger picture." Gutfeld tried to interrupt, but Jasmine didn't let him. "It's easy to mock what you don't understand. But when you make a joke about the very lives of people who have been failed by this system, you're not just dismissing them. You're erasing their voices." For a moment, the audience was still. There were no snickers, no half-hearted applause, just silence. The kind of silence that speaks louder than any word or punchline ever could. Gutfeld, now visibly rattled, tried one last attempt. "So you think you have all the answers?" "I think the answers are in the people," Jasmine replied. "They've been living with these problems every day. I'm just here to help bring their voices to the forefront." Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. The room was silent, heavy with the weight of what had just been said. Greg Gutfeld, now visibly uncomfortable, tried to recover, but it was clear the dynamic had shifted. He wasn't the one in control anymore. The sharp sarcasm, the quick jab snown of it was landing the way it usually did. Instead, it was Crockett who had the audience's attention. For a brief moment, The producers in the control room, who had expected this segment to be just another round of sound bites and easy laughs, were whispering into their headsets. This wasn't what they planned for. Gutfeld, desperate to reclaim the floor, shifted gears once again. "So, you're basically telling us that the whole system is broken," he said, his voice rising slightly. "That it's all a mess, and we need to start over? That's a pretty big claim, don't you think?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. She didn't react with outrage or indignation. She responded with quiet confidence. "It's not about starting over, Greg. It's about accountability. Acknowledging that some people are more affected by this system than others, and making sure the ones who benefit from it are held responsible for the harm it causes." The tension in the room was now palpable. The panelists, who had been sitting back and letting Gutfeld steer the conversation, were now looking at Crockett with a new level of respect. She wasn't just defending her position. She was making a case that had nothing to do with politics or party lines. It was about justice, plain and simple. Gutfeld, feeling the pressure mounting, tried again. "And what about the people who don't see it the way you do? What about the ones who think the system is working just fine?" Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her gaze never leaving Gutfeld. "Those people aren't living it. They aren't sitting in courtrooms where the poor get harsher sentences than the rich. They aren't seeing kids who make mistakes being treated like criminals, while people who commit financial crimes walk away with a slap on the wrist. Until they see it, they won't understand." There was a beat of silence. Gutfeld, trying to recover, laughed nervously. Okay, you've made your point." But the words didn't feel convincing. They didn't feel like the usual quick rebuttals he was used to. Jasmine had made him pause, made him rethink his own rhetoric. The audience, who had been primed to laugh at Crockett's expense, now seemed unsure how to react. They had been expecting a fiery confrontation, a back and forth full of mockery and sharp retorts. But Jasmine had thrown them off. She wasn't here to fight in the usual ways. She was simply telling the truth, and it wasn't something they could laugh off. Gutfeld glanced at his notes, clearly searching for something to say, but the words didn't come. For the first time in the segment, he looked out of his depth. Jasmine didn't need to dominate the conversation. She had already won the room's attention not with volume, but with her steady presence and unshakable resolve. Jasmine spoke again, her voice calm but firm. "The media doesn't always show the full story. It doesn't show the broken families or the people who fall through the cracks. And when it does, it's framed as a problem, not as a result of the system itself." Gutfeld tried to interrupt, but it was too late. Jasmine wasn't just presenting facts. She was forcing the audience to look at something they hadn't wanted to see. And that was a shift that couldn't be undone by a joke or a punchline. The producers in the control room remained still. The segment had gone far beyond what they expected. It wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a moment of reckoning. The show's control room was buzzing with quiet tension as Jasmine Crockett held her ground. On stage, Greg Gutfeld, the man who had usually controlled every conversation, had fallen silent. His usual quick-witted responses, the sarcasm that usually won over the audience, were no longer working. He looked around, searching for a way out, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't giving him any openings. She had done something different from what people expected. Rather than respond to insults with insults or jabs with jabs, she had calmly dismantled his arguments one by one, each time forcing him into a corner where his usual tactics were ineffective. What was unfolding in front of the live studio audience wasn't just a debate, it was a realization. There was no dramatic gasp, no overwhelming applause at first. The studio's audience was unusually quiet. For the first time in the segment, they were no longer laughing at the host's quips. They were really listening to the argument Crockett was presenting. Gutfeld, still trying to regain his footing, turned the conversation back to the topic of media responsibility. "You want accountability, but what about personal responsibility?" he asked, shifting the blame onto society at large. "What about the people who don't want reform but just want things to stay safe?" Jasmine Crockett's response was calm, but it carried the weight of years of lived experience. Safety means different things to different people, Greg. For some, safety means fewer police. For others, it's more. But if we don't address why people feel unsafe, we're not solving the problem. We're just fueling fear. For the first time in the night, Gutfeld didn't have a comeback. He looked away, his usual smirk fading. The audience sensed it too. Jasmine wasn't here to argue for one side of the political spectrum. She was here to speak truth, to speak for the people who hadn't been heard for too long. She wasn't interested in winning the segment. She was interested in exposing the cracks in the system. With each point she made, she peeled back layers of ignorance and avoidance that people had lived with for too long. And it wasn't just a clap back or a clever retort. It was a direct challenge to the way things had always been. As the segment came to a close, Gutfeld didn't even try to recover with his usual ending remark. The producers, who had been anticipating this to be another typical show, were scrambling in the background, discussing what had just happened. They could feel the shift. Off stage, there was no celebration, no applause from the crew. The atmosphere felt heavy. Jasmine Crockett wasn't there for a viral moment or a media spectacle. She was there for a bigger purpose, one that transcended the trivial back and forth. The moment had gone viral, but not because of the theatrics. It was her unwavering calm, her presence in the face of a constant barrage of mockery that had made the difference. Gutfeld, on the other hand, couldn't return to his usual antics. The audience had seen something different, something real. Backstage, as the cameras cut to commercial, Jasmine Crockett remained calm. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't raised her voice, but there was something in her presence that had shifted the entire energy of the show. The producers, who were used to the usual quick back and forths and comedic jabs, exchanged uneasy glances. They knew this segment was different. Outside the studio, the world was already buzzing. Clips from the segment were popping up across social media, shared with captions like, "Jasmine Crockett bodying Greg Gutfeld," and "This is how you handle disrespect with facts." Her words were being dissected, debated, and praised by people who had never heard of her before. A tweet from a high school debate team in Ohio read, "We just used Jasmine Crockett's segment as a perfect example of how to dismantle an argument calmly. This is how it's done." In Dallas, where Crockett had grown up, her friends and family were calling, texting, and watching the segment on repeat. The reaction was overwhelming, not just from her supporters, but from people who had never seen her in action before. Her calm strength had resonated in a way few expected. Inside the studio, Greg Gutfeld walked into the green room after the segment ended. His usual swagger, the confident, joking persona that had carried him through countless debates, was gone. He paced the room, trying to brush off what had just happened, but the weight of Jasmine Crockett's words lingered. His team had tried to stay upbeat, focusing on the fact that the segment had gone viral, that people were talking about it. But there was no escaping the truth. Crockett had outmaneuvered him at every turn, and he hadn't seen it coming. His assistant, Rick, stood by the door, waiting for him to say something. But Greg didn't speak. Instead, he grabbed his phone, scanning through social media posts. Some were defending him, sure, but the overwhelming sentiment was clear. Crockett had shifted the conversation. She had exposed the flaws in the system and done it with quiet precision, without the usual theatrics. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett sat in her own dressing room, scrolling through her phone, but not distracted by the overwhelming flood of messages and mentions. She read one text from a friend in Sacramento that stood out. "I saw it. I was in tears. I've sat in rooms where I wasn't listened to. Thank you for not letting them silence you." That, more than anything, resonated with her. It wasn't about the viral clips or the attention. It was about the people who felt empowered by seeing someone speak their truth without backing down. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just fighting for a cause. She was showing people that their voices mattered, that they didn't have to scream to be heard, they just had to stand firm, like she had done on that stage. By the time she left the studio, she wasn't celebrating. There was no need. The fight for justice, the real work, was still ahead. What she had done on live television wasn't about winning a debate. It was about showing a different kind of strength, one that didn't rely on volume or anger, but on truth and clarity. Back in her district, Jasmine Crockett was already planning her next move. She wasn't riding on the wave of that viral moment. She was focused on the legislation she was drafting and the communities she was working to help. The media had its moments, but she knew the real work was in the quiet spaces, in the places where change was being built from the ground up. The buzz from the segment didn't fade quickly. Jasmine Crockett had stepped into that studio on the Gutfeld show expecting a debate, but what transpired was more significant. What the world saw wasn't just a confrontation between a politician and a television host. They saw a quiet power that could cut through the noise, a refusal to back down when the pressure was on. Back in the studio, after the show, the crew was still processing what had happened. It wasn't just the fact that Crockett had handled herself well. It was the way she had transformed the entire segment. The atmosphere had shifted. There was no longer a need for mockery or quick quips. Jasmine's calm, focused demeanor had left everyone in the room questioning what mattered most. In an environment built on sarcasm and sound bites, she had made the room listen not with loud rhetoric, but with quiet authority. When Greg Gutfeld walked off the set, he didn't have the usual swagger. He was still processing the fact that he had been outmatched. In the past, he would have brushed it off with a joke or a quick comeback, but tonight, it wasn't that easy. He could sense that the conversation had changed, and he didn't quite know how to get it back. As he walked past his assistant, Rick, Gutfeld muttered something under his breath, but it wasn't directed at anyone in particular. It was just a sign of his frustration. He wasn't used to this level of confrontation, especially from someone who didn't flinch when faced with his usual tactics. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett had already moved past the moment. She didn't gloat, didn't bask in the attention. Instead, she focused on the messages flooding in, some of them from people who had been moved by her words. One text from a teacher in Tallahassee read, "My daughter wants to be a lawyer now." Your words changed everything for her. Another from a retired judge in Fresno said, "You reminded us that credibility isn't about volume. It's about truth." The overwhelming sentiment wasn't about Crockett's victory in that moment, but the way she had challenged the status quo. She had forced people to rethink their assumptions. She had shown that, sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is remain calm in the face of adversity. But for Jasmine, the viral moment was just that, a moment. She wasn't interested in chasing the spotlight. Instead, she was focused on what lay ahead. In the days following the broadcast, she didn't book interviews or press tours. Instead, she spent time reading up on new bills, meeting with constituents, and listening to their concerns. Her real work, she knew, wasn't in headlines or viral clips. It was in the quiet spaces, in the rooms where real change was made. And while the media focused on her performance on television, Jasmine Crockett was already preparing for the next step, ensuring that her work, her voice, and her mission would leave a lasting impact, not just for herself, but for the people she represented. In her district, there were no television cameras, no interviews. But there were people who needed her, who needed to be heard. Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. This was only the beginning.